The Ivory God by J.S. Fletcher. At 6 o'clock Thurston put down his pen, pushed his chair back from the table at which he had been writing, and rose to his feet with a series of gestures indicative of mental and physical fatigue. He glanced at the few sheets of manuscript which represented the result of a long day's labour, and he frowned, as if in anger or distaste. From 10 o'clock until 1, and again from 2 until 6, his entire product after 7 hours' work was comparatively infinitesimal. He had felt no enthusiasm, he had been unable to concentrate his thoughts, the whole thing had been distasteful to him. As he glanced around him he asked himself for the 1000th time whether the game was worth the candle. More from force of habit than from genuine desire to do it, Thurston proceeded to make some sort of toilet for the evening. He shaved and washed carefully. He put on a clean linen shirt and a dark lounge suit. He was unduly particular about the fold of his tie. In several small ways he showed that he had a gentlemanlike love of cleanliness and orderly habits. He did everything very slowly. It would have been evident to anyone who might have had an opportunity of watching him that he had no engagement to keep. In point of fact, he had few friends with whom he could have kept any engagement. He was, as he now never cared to remind himself, one of the very loneliest men living. For a while he had reminded himself of this pertinent truth somewhat often, then he wearied of the thought and put it from him. The fact of the loneliness, however, remained. Thurston lived in 2 rooms at the top of a house which stood in a quiet street near the British Museum, a street of an aspect so grey and pathetic that you wondered at first sight of it whether laughter or children's voices were ever heard there. The 2 rooms opened into one another by means of a folding door. Thurston had furnished them himself when he first came to town. One room contained a camp bedstead, a chest of drawers, a dressing-table, a washstand, a bath, and a hard-bottomed chair. The floor was stained and polished, and destitute of carpet, but there was a thick bearskin rug at the bedside. It was absolutely destitute of luxuries or of pictures, but it possessed a first-rate reading lamp, attached to the wall at the head of the bed. The other room knew the luxury of books. Its walls were covered with them to half their height. The books related chiefly to philosophy, theology, history, metaphysics. There was little that was light, but a table was strewn with the reviews of several countries, all purchased second-hand and when a month old. A desk, littered with papers, stood in the window. An armchair was placed near the hearth. 2 other chairs of an easiest sort occurred, sometimes here, sometimes there. A small table, big enough for 1 person to eat at, was in the middle of the room, which, unlike the sleeping-chamber, was softly carpeted and luxuriant in thick rugs. It also possessed some luxuries in the way of pictures, but these, to the English eye of ordinary knowledge, were of a strange taste, being Japanese. One skilled in such matters might have told you that they were all by the most celebrated Japanese artists. Even then you would have felt some uneasiness at the prospect of being continually shut up in a room whose decorations were so purely Eastern. In these 2 rooms Thurston had spent 5 years, every day corresponding to another. He prepared his own breakfast when he wished for it. He read or wrote when he desired to do so. He lunched and dined out. He spent his evenings reading or thinking or dreaming. It was a strange life altogether, but it was his. But, then, the few people who knew Thurston said that he was a strange man, a man who spoke little, laughed never, smiled seldom, and who was quite young, in spite of everything. In point of fact, he was 27 years old. At 22 he had left Oxford with some reputation as a scholar and a mystic, and had come to town with the set purpose of following a literary career. Whether he had any ambitions at the time is a debatable question. It is quite certain that at 27 none of them had been carried out. He had a little money of his own, sufficient to pay his rent, his housekeeping expenses, his tailor's bills, and so on, and there was, therefore, no need to keep his nose to the grindstone. But he had made no name. He sometimes exhibited a rather heavy, rather pedantic, rather wearisome sort of article to one or other of the leading reviews, the sort of article which is spoken of with the greatest respect by the critics, and read only by a few experts, but to the general public he was as unknown as an unborn babe. The people who had any dealings with him said that he was unsociable. He had no conversation. If by any chance he was induced to lunch or dine with you, his sole notion seemed to be to get away as quickly as possible. It was evident that he was one of those men who like to be alone. There were times, however, when Thurston felt his loneliness, and one of them was hanging heavily about him on this particular evening. He had found it difficult to write during the day, and more than once he had caught himself wishing that a friend would come in and break the solitude. But he would have been hard put to it to say where such a friend was to be found. He never encouraged anyone to visit him at his rooms. One or two men, old college acquaintances, had tracked him down and called upon him, but quickly discovered that they were not wanted. It was not that Thurston wished to be rude. It was simply that a certain shyness and loneliness ran in his blood and his temperament, and made him incapable of entertaining his fellow creatures. He was essentially an anchorite, and yet there were times when the flesh called for something which it would have found it hard to define in words. As Thurston drew on his overcoat, a light tap came at his door, and he went across and opened it, not without some feeling of surprise that anyone should be there. In the faint light at the top of the landing he saw a man whom he did not recognize. A tall, sloping-shouldered man, whose back was somewhat bowed, whose knees bent in, a man who made a succession of angles in his clothes. Thurston could see that he was shabbily attired, that his hair was long, greasy, and unclean. He had a vague notion that an unwashed atmosphere hung heavily all around and about his visitor. He held the door half open, staring at the man. The man blinked at him. "Mr. Thurston?" he said inquiringly. "Well?" replied Thurston. The man sighed heavily. "I was sent to you, sir, by Mr. Evanson. I have something to show you which he thought you might like to see. He thought you might not be indisposed to buy it from me. May I come in and show it to you, Mr. Thurston?" said the man, indicating a small parcel which he carried in the crook of one arm. "I am not disposed to buy anything," answered Thurston, keeping his place. "But this, sir, is something very uncommon. It is seldom that any collector has the chance of securing such a valuable curiosity," urged the visitor. "At any rate, it will do you no harm to look at it, Mr. Thurston." "Well," said Thurston, impassively and hesitatingly, "you may bring it in, then. But I really don't want to see it, and I shan't buy it, whatever it may be." He turned away and made preparations for lighting a lamp. The man with the parcel lingered at the threshold until the lamp had been placed on the centre table, and the apartment was bathed in a clear, powerful light. "Now then," said Thurston, still impassive as ever, "come forward and let me see what it is. Mr. Evanson has no business to send you to me. I'm merely an acquaintance of his, and I'm certainly not a collector. What is it you have to show me?" The untidy and unwashed person took small notice of this impatient outburst. He advanced to the table, placed his parcel near the lamp, and proceeded to divest it of its wrappings. He kept himself between Thurston and the parcel while this was going on, and he did not speak until he suddenly turned round, and said, with a note of great pride and triumph in his voice, "There, Mr. Thurston, look at that!" Thurston, during the unfolding of the parcel, had fallen into a sort of daydream. He came out of it with a start, and looked at the object which his visitor had placed on the table in the full light of the lamp. A sudden gleam came into his rather dull eyes, a sudden exclamation burst from his lips. "Ah!" he said. The man smiled and rubbed his hands. He chuckled. "I thought that it would move you, Mr. Thurston," he said. "It's a beauty, isn't it?" Thurston made no answer to this. He advanced to the table and stood at its edge, contemplating the thing which his visitor had been so anxious to exhibit. He found himself staring at an ivory statue of the god Ganesha, and wondering at the exquisite beauty of the workmanship, the subtle tints of the ivory, the atmosphere of the mystic East, which its mere dumb presence suggested and conveyed. It was not a thing of any great size, its breadth 6. A cigar-box would have held it. And to Thurston, steeped to the lips in the odour and colour of the Orient, it represented a world of art and of dreams. He stared at the god. The god stared at him out of a pair of amethyst eyes, cunningly set into the creamy white of the ivory. A strange intoxication stole into Thurston's soul. He heard himself presently talking in set fashion, calmly, methodically, as though he were in a shop, buying something. He heard his visitor's replies. "You want to sell this?" "Yes, sir, I want to sell it. I'll tell you how I came about it, too, Mr. Thurston. All's above board, and Mr. Evanson, he knows me well, and knew me before I fell on hard times. It was this way, sir. My father was in the army at the time of the mutiny, and he saw a good deal of fighting out in India, Delhi and Lucknow and elsewhere, and he brought home a good many curiosities, and that image amongst them. It's the image of some Hindu god, so I'm told, and of course anybody can see the workmanship is excellent. My father gave it to me on his deathbed, and charged me never to part with it, because there's some legend about its bringing luck with it. But it's brought me no luck," continued Thurston's visitor, with a dismal laugh. "I've been down on my luck for some time. However, it will bring luck if you're agreeable to buy it, sir. Perhaps that's where the luck comes in." "What price do you set upon it?" asked Thurston mechanically. "Well, sir, I, of course, don't know anything about these matters. I was recommended to take the carving to Mr. Evanson," said the man, "and he advised me to see you. I should be quite satisfied to take what he said he thought it was worth." "What was that?" said Thurston. £20, sir." The man uttered these words with some anxiety, and his eyes fastened themselves on Thurston's face, as if to watch the effect. Thurston, however, was still fascinated by the Ivory God, and neither eyes nor lips betrayed anything. He remained silent for some moments. At last he started, as if from a reverie. "I am quite prepared to accept Mr. Evanson's estimate of the carving's value," he said. "I will give you £20 for it." The man bowed his untidy head, and sighed deeply. It was evident that the prospect of immediate possession of £20 was very grateful to him. "Thank you, sir," he said. Thurston went over to his desk, unlocked a drawer, and produced a cash-box, which, on examination, proved to contain £22 notes and gold. He counted out 20 to his visitor, put £2 in his own pocket, restored the depleted cash-box to its drawer, and locked it up again, and then, asking the vendor his name and address, wrote out a formal receipt. 5 minutes later the unkempt person was descending the stairs, happy in the possession of a small fortune, and Thurston was left alone with the Ivory God. The clanging of the street door, far below, plunged the house into a weird silence. In its midst Thurston sighed deeply. There was a strange feeling within him that he had suddenly come into possession of something which he had been wanting all his life. It was akin to the feeling of a lover to whom the much-desired object of affection is at last given. When the stranger first unwrapped the Ivory God and revealed its strange charm to his eyes, Thurston became aware of a sense of satisfaction. This sense was now increasing to the point of something like delight. He drew in his nether lip, and began to utter a soft, sibilant sound, not unlike the purring of a cat. Not for many years had he experienced such a keen feeling of pleasure as that which now filled him. He began looking about him for a suitable place wherein to enshrine his new acquisition. He glanced at the chimney-piece, already ornamented profusely with carvings from China, Japan, and India, with stones and vases from Peru, and turned away dissatisfied. The Ivory God, he said to himself, must have a better setting than the chimney-piece offered. He wanted to have it near him while he wrote. There was something in the lines, in the dull white of the ivory, in the subtle purple tints of the amethyst eyes, which bade fair to soothe and to fascinate. He wished to have the Ivory God upon his desk. Looking about the room, he caught sight of a little triptych which he had bought years ago in Venice, admiring it more for the fineness of the wood and the carving than from the elementary art of the figure of Christ, which was placed in the centre niche. Its dark wood, he thought, would make an admirable setting to the pallid tint of the ivory, and without hesitation he took it down from the wall, wrenched away the crucifix from the middle compartment, and installed the figure of the Hindu god in its place. Then he placed the triptych on the ledge above his desk, and stood back from it, admiring the bizarre effect. The amethyst eyes of the Ivory God seemed to smile into his own.